The Sacred Romance, Chapter 5, The Wildness of God. We live our lives before the wild, dangerous, unfettered, and free character of the living God. The unknown romancing, or the message of the arrows. Which captures the essence of life? Should we keep our hearts open to the romance or concentrate on protecting ourselves from the arrows? Should we live with hopeful abandon, trusting in a larger story whose ending is good? Or should we live our small stories and glean what we can from the romance while trying to avoid the arrows? Perhaps God, as the author of the story we're living in, would tilt the scale in a favorable direction if we knew we could trust him. And therein lies our dilemma. There seems to be no direct correlation between the way we live our lives and the resulting fate God has in store for us, at least on this earth. Abraham's grandson Jacob lives the life of a manipulator and is blessed. Jesus lives for the sake of others and is crucified. And we never quite know when we're going to run into the uncertainty of the part God has written for us in his play, whether our character has significant lines yet to speak, or will even survive the afternoon. I, Brent, was confronted with my own questions about him at the most elemental level when I was a fourth grader in David C. Crockett Elementary School in Bryan, Texas. As a northerner, recently moved from New Jersey, I quickly discovered that there had been a civil war and that there were still amends to be made. That fall, for what seemed like weeks, the four of us from the northern states were sent to one end of the playground where we waited to be attacked by the forces of the Confederacy. And since we were considerably outnumbered, unlike those 1860s Union infantry, we were soon enough captured and taken to prison camp. The camp was a large mulch pile of dead leaves, surrounded by chicken wire and presided over by a sixth grader named Jimmy. Jimmy's favorite form of punishment was to drag the terrified waif last captured to the middle of the pile and lower his considerable 150-pound bulk until the prisoner disappeared from view. I cannot describe the terror I felt at being taken to Jimmy. Much of any leg speed I have came from a determination to be the last one captured on a given day, in a hopes that the school bell would ring before my internment. I remember one of my friends, a boy from Ohio named Terry, being sat on so long one day I feared he was dead. I looked around for teachers or parents or even a sympathetic sixth grader who would help us. No one came. I finally yelled for Jimmy to let Terry up before he killed him. With a smile and the best bad guy form from the movies, he rose majestically and ordered my guards to put me in Terry's place. I remember landing in the leaves with only the thought that I'd be suffocated, or worse, made to cry in front of everybody. Before Jimmy could lower himself all the way, I squirmed free, jumped the chicken wire, and raced to the far ends of the playground to outlast the recess bell. Somehow, I could never find the way to express this daily terror to my parents. I felt totally alone with it. The question in our heart. Of course, all of us have lived through events such as I have described, some much, much worse, and if they took place in the setting of family, school, or work, perhaps lasting for years, the terror that we enter and the seeming lack of rescue from it leave us with a deeply imprinted question about God that we hide in our heart, sometimes not allowing the light of day to touch it for years, even deep into our spiritual journey. We cover the question with rationalizations that let him off the hook and allow us to still believe, but our beliefs rest on foundations that move and quake under us. It is easy to reason that Jimmy and those sixth graders were just bad, not raised in very good homes. And of course, our rationalizations do bear a modicum of truth that keeps us from dealing with the question lodged deep in our heart, hidden from our conscious mind. Do you care for me, God? What's under that question? Blaise Pascal, in his Pensées, says, The heart has its reasons, the reason knows not of. What's under the question is our personal story, often punctuated by the message of the arrows. Parents who were emotionally absent, bedtimes without words or hugs, ears that were too big, noses that were too small, others chosen for playground games while we were not, and prayers about these things seemingly met with silence. And embedded in our stories, deep down in our heart, in a place so well guarded that they've rarely, if ever, been exposed to the light of day, are other grief-laden and often angry questions. God, why did you allow this to happen to me? Why did you make me like this? What would you allow to happen next? In the secret places of our heart, we believe God is the one who did not protect us from these things, or even the one who perpetrated them upon us. Our questions about him make us begin to live with a deep apprehension that clings anxiously to the depths of our hearts. Do you really care for me, God? This is the question that has shipwrecked many of our hearts, leaving them grounded on reefs of pain and doubt, no longer free to accompany us on a spiritual pilgrimage. We might be able to rationalize away that question by telling ourselves that we need to be more careful, or that sometimes others are just as bad. We can even breathe a sigh of relief when we realize that trouble has come from our own sin. But even the careful, legalistic, and constricted lifestyle that arises out of thinking we can avoid trouble through our own devices shipwrecks when the arrows seem to strike us out of nowhere. What are we to make of God's wildness in allowing these things to happen? A part too large. Indeed, the things that have happened to us often suggest the real script of the play we're living in is God's indifferent rather than God is love. Deep down in our heart, in the place where the story is formed, this experience of God as indifferent drives us to write our own scripts, as John described in chapter 4. Job apparently lived with this anxiety about God even before his tribulations descended upon him, as evidenced by his exclamation from the ashes of his home and his life, "What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me," Job 3:25. Job was a God-fearing man, and yet something in him suspected that faith in God did not necessarily translate into peace and safety. Of course, Job had no inkling of the discussion going on in heaven between God and Satan. It was a debate over whether the foundation of God's kingdom was based on genuine love or power. And astonishingly, God was placing the perception of his own integrity, as well as the reputation of his whole kingdom, on the genuineness of Job's heart. Eavesdrop with me on one of the most revealing conversations in the scriptures. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything that he has? You've blessed the work of his hands, so his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." On another day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself to him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life, but stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he had said. Job 1, 6 through 12, and 2, 1 through 10. When Job's three friends came along and witnessed the devastation of his life, they tore their clothes, sprinkled dust on their heads, and appropriately sat in silence with him for 7 days because they saw how great his suffering was. The story doesn't tell us much about what they were feeling during those 7 days, but their subsequent counsel gives us a pretty good idea of what they were thinking. Eliphaz the Temanite basically responded to Job's continued groaning by saying, "Job, you've been our man. We've watched you carefully to see how you gain God's blessings so that we can do it just like you do. You know how this religion business works. If you're innocent, you'll be okay. If you've sinned, you won't. Since you're not okay, you've obviously blown it. There can be no other explanation for what's going on here." Job 4, 1 through 8. God's direct correlation or correction of Job's friends exposed some of the secret demand of their hearts. They, like all of us do at one time or another, had been relating to God like one of the Mesopotamian household gods that the peoples of the Middle East were so familiar with. The cultures in the cradle of civilization lived with a pantheon of gods who themselves existed in a kind of hierarchy. There were gods of war, fertility, and harvest who were acknowledged by the culture as a whole, and under these, a litany of household gods, usually statues made of crafted wood, clay, and precious metals, that were placed on the family mantle. People related to each of the gods by means of specific rituals and ceremonies whereby their protection and favor could be gained. Each family literally owned their own god. To use an illustration from our culture, these household gods were somewhat like having a mobster for a neighbor. To those outside the neighborhood, the mobster might be seem fearful and somewhat sinister, but if you're his immediate neighbor and treat him with some deference and respect, he may get you a good deal on aluminum siding or a new car. Or he might have a bag of dead cats deposited on the doorstep of a man down the street who you casually mentioned was allowing his dog to dig in your flower beds. When the living God of the Old Testament came along, he seemed to fit right into this way of thinking, describing himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He gave Moses a regimen of laws, rituals, and ceremonies to be followed if the Israelites were to gain his favor. Everything should have worked out fine. The familiar household God religion was very simple and well understood by everyone. Simply obey the prescribed rules, regulations, and rituals that the God thought were important for whatever reason, and he would be appeased and give out his blessing. The Israelites never bothered to read between the lines. They were totally unprepared and unwilling to consider the thought that they, like Job, were involved in a much bigger drama. Indeed, when we consider how central a part Job was given in the drama God was directing, we're confronted with the reality that we too could be in the same position. It seems that the part God has written for us is much too big and certainly too dangerous. Paul confirms this thought in Ephesians when he tells us, "The church you see is not peripheral to the world. The world is peripheral to the church." The church is Christ's body in which he speaks and acts, by which he fills everything with his presence. Verse 1, or chapter 1, 22 through 23 in the Message translation. Each human being is of great significance to God, but those whom God has drawn to believe in him are center stage in a drama of cosmic proportions. When we look on Job's time on the center stage, we find that God not only allows the Prince of Darkness to come before his throne, he points Job out to him and, in effect, unleashes him on the defenseless man. This is very much akin to a policeman drawing the attention of a gang of thugs to a young man walking lawfully along the street with his wife, children, and belongings. He then gives the gangsters permission to test the man's respect for the law by mugging and robbing him and killing his children. I find myself asking, was this really necessary to test Job's heart? What was going on here anyway? I want to ask, if God is the author, producer, and director of this play, what kind of a story is he telling? I'm filled with not a little outrage as well as anxiety that wants to ask a much smaller part in the play that Job had, or possibly even a role in a more off-Broadway production that I could help direct. Something like God helps Brent pursue money, wealth, and fame while living a quiet life. There's something frightening about being in a play in which the director may allow the plot to descend on my character from a totally unknown direction, a direction that may cause me deep emotional or even physical harm. It is something like having the stage lights dropped from high overhead during one of my scenes without telling me, leaving me no chance to change my mark before they fall. God's artistry as playwright of the story we find ourselves living in often seems to use up characters like trailer courts in tornado season. He assures us, notably in the Psalms, that he sees our pain and cares for us, and that our tormentors will be judged. But he still calls us firmly to our marks, regardless of disease, calamity, age, sex, or strength. He comes to Job in the midst of his loss, pain, and indeed nearness of death, and says, referring to the ongoing discussion between Job and his friends, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." Job 38, 2 and 3. This is followed by his lengthy interrogation of Job's understanding of even the physical creation, much less any more profound issues. I must admit that there is something in me as a man that feels strangely respected by this approach, while another part of me thinks, how unfeeling and cold. When God comes to call Jeremiah to be his prophet of hard sayings to Judah, Jeremiah protests, saying, "Ah, sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak. I'm only a child." But the Lord said to me, "Do not say I am only a child. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and I will rescue you, declares the Lord." Jeremiah 1, 6 through 8. God is saying that these things will be done through Jeremiah's dependence on his strength and provision, and that he will rescue him. Yet there is something about God's rescues that make them a little less timely than dialing 911. He leaves Abraham with his knife raised and ready to plunge into Isaac's heart, and Isaac waiting for the knife to descend. He leaves Joseph languishing for years in an Egyptian prison. He allows the Israelites to suffer 400 years of bondage under the Egyptians, and leaves those same Israelites backed against the Red Sea with Pharaoh's chariots thundering down on them. He abandons Jesus to the cross and does not rescue him at all. And then there are those of us who, along with the saints under heaven's very altar, are groaning under the weight of things gone wrong, waiting for that same Jesus to return and sweep us up with him in power and glory. "How long, Lord?" we whisper in our weariness and pain. Indeed, God calls us to battles where the deck appears stacked in favor of those who are his enemies and ours, just to increase the drama of the play. And there is a clear picture, even from God himself, that he does so to enhance his own glory. In C.S. Lewis's novel, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, of the Chronicles of Narnia series, 4 children, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, pass through the wardrobe's portal to find the kingdom of Narnia imprisoned under the spell of the White Witch. Aslan the lion, who is the king of Narnia, is nowhere to be found. Although rumor has it he is on the move, he appears to have abandoned his kingdom to the White Witch, who spends her leisure time turning the inhabitants into lawn statuary. The 4 children set out to explore this strange and somewhat frightening new country that is locked under evil's spell. They come upon Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, a husband and wife still faithful to Aslan. The Beavers argue that the Beavers assure the children that Aslan is about to return to set things right, and that prophecy suggests they have very important, even central part to play in the drama about to unfold. Indeed, they learn they are actually to rule with Aslan from Cair Paravel itself, Aslan's royal city. Faced with this fearful yet exciting news, Lucy and Susan's thoughts go to what Aslan is actually like. If he is a king who is safe, they reason, they will certainly be of great comfort. That will certainly be of great comfort in light of the battle being all but lost. Is he a man? Asked Lucy. Aslan, a man, said Beaver sternly. Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly. Then he isn't safe? Said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. When we were young, most of us loved adventure. There's something about the unknown that draws us, which is why we like stories so much. But I like to leave the theater at the end of the play, knowing that the dilemma of evil has been resolved by the characters on the stage or the screen. Like Peter, Susan, Lucy, and Edmund, to find ourselves not as spectators but central characters in the play itself is somewhat daunting. The stakes are truly high, sometimes literally life or death, and God rarely, if ever, yells cut, just as the dangerous or the painful scene descends upon us. No stunt doubles come onto the set to take our places. Many of us feel that we've been playing these kinds of scenes ever since we were children. We wonder if the hero will ever show up to rescue us. We would like to picture goodness as being synonymous with safety. When we think of God being good, we perhaps picture someone like Al on the popular TV program Home Improvement. He's someone who carefully plans out each task ahead of time and has all the proper tools and safety equipment in place. Someone who has thought out every possible danger ahead of time and made allowances to ensure our safety as his workmate. Someone who goes to bed early, gets plenty of rest, and wears flannel shirts as a mark of his reliability. Being in partnership with God, though, often feels much more like being Mel Gibson's sidekick in the movie Lethal Weapon. In his determination to deal with the bad guy, he leaps from the 7th-story balconies into swimming pools, surprised that we would have any hesitation in following after him. Like Indiana Jones' love interest in the movies, we find ourselves caught up in an adventure of heroic proportions with a God who both seduces us with his boldness and energy and repels us with his willingness to place us in mortal danger, suspended over pits of snakes. One strain of the modernist school of art is famous for creating masterpieces by standing back 20 feet and hurling paint onto the canvas. In answer to those who would criticize such a careless approach, they argue that chance is the real artist at work in this life, and they do not want to interfere with its creative process. Our experience of what God is doing sometimes felt from a perspective is sometimes felt from the perspective of one of those paint molecules. We come crashing onto the canvas, who knows where, intermingled with whatever fates bring along next. Indeed, one of Satan's most powerful whisperings to us is that we are expendable. He may admit that we are part of God's plan for his own glory, but only in the same way Napoleon used his soldiers to establish his empire. When the going got rough in the Russian winter campaign, Napoleon hightailed it back to Paris in his carriage, leaving Marshal Ney and the remnants of the once grand army to make it back the best way they could. At one point in the long, arduous campaign of delivering to Judah the bad news of coming judgment and futile calls for repentance, Jeremiah explodes with thoughts that have apparently been building in him for a while with regard to God's use of him. O Lord, you deceived me, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out, proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. But if I say, I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, his word is like a fire in my heart, and a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. Jeremiah 20:7-9, NIV. Jeremiah complains that not only has God written a play that casts him in a devastating role, but has also placed a fire in his heart that will not let him leave the play, even if he wants to. And there is a fire in all of us, felt as a desire for intimacy and hunger for meaning that we must literally kill if we want to escape the play. To all of these charges, God is unrepentant, even as he was with Job. His response to these things is basically along the lines of, I am who I am, I do what I do, I am good. What are you going to do with me? Ironically, at the end of the interrogation by God, Job picks himself up and repents. He goes away with a sense of, oh, now I get it. I was foolish to have lost perspective. God turns to Job's friends who've been expounding the standard household God formula to Job. If you don't sin, things will go well. For example, you can control your destiny. And tells them quite plainly they know nothing about him. He tells them he will have his friend Job pray for them. Faced with the message of the arrows and a part too big that the cosmic playwright insists is ours, with our little clarity on meaning and relationship of our scenes and character to the larger play, it appears more sensible to opt out and go off Broadway. Even though the smaller plays we write are often just pieces of story, becoming our own directors and playwrights at least promises a level of control over the script. We hope we can eliminate most of the relational unknowns along with the villain and live with our smaller stories and some modicum of peace and quiet. What is this drama God has dropped us into the middle of? What act of the play are we actually in? And what do our scenes have to do with the larger story being told? Is it our well-being? Is our well-being even a consideration in the storyline? There's a stirring scene in Shakespeare's play, Henry V, that perhaps gives us a glimpse of what God is up to, both in the larger story he's telling, as well as his purpose in our own lives, as he makes us a part of all of this. Henry, the Christian king of England, has invaded France. After several battles, his army is worn down to 6,000 or 7,000 weary, hungry, and sick soldiers. Dogged by rain and cold and thoughts of perhaps never seeing home again, the French army, fresh and 30,000 strong, sends a courier to offer Henry the opportunity to avoid certain and ignominious defeat by surrendering. The hearts of Henry's army are divided as to the wisdom of the battle. The king knows that hearts are divided. The hearts that are divided are hearts already defeated, and he delivers a stirring speech on St. Crispin's Day, capturing his soldiers' hearts up into something much larger. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispin. That he that outlives this day and comes home safe will stand a tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispin. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors, and say, "Tomorrow is St. Crispin." Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars, and say, "These wounds I had on Crispin's day." Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall name our names, familiar in their mouths as household words, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but in it we shall be remembered. Acts 4, Scene 3. Stirred to the core by the power of these words, Henry's men throw themselves into the battle with abandon and defeat the French in a total rout. King Henry calls his men to something that transcends safety and common sense. He calls them to battle and suffering that will bring them all a glorious remembering in the hearts of men. His words rouse something that burns within their hearts, something set there for the purposes of the king. The battles God calls us to, the woundings and cripplings of soul and body we all receive, cannot simply be ascribed to our sin and foolishness, or even to the sin and foolishness of others. When Jesus and the disciples were on the road one day, they came upon a man who had been blind since birth. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents?" they asked him. "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life." And with that, Jesus spat on the ground, made some mud to place on the man's eyes, and healed him. John 9, 1-7. Many of us who are reading these words have not yet received God's healing. The display of God's works through our wounds, losses, and sufferings is yet to be revealed, and so we groan and we wonder. A strange redemption. Yet there is something else God knows about us that causes him, like Henry V, to exhort us on to battle, and sometimes even enter battle against us. Most of us are convinced at some level in our heart that our main difficulty is the capriciousness of life. If we could ever overcome the damage of other sins against us and just be loved better by those around us, and perhaps love a little better ourselves, we reason, we would be free to live well. For the most part, we don't see ourselves as people who are deeply committed to following a path to death. The way we want to live feels so right, so much like life. The only problem seems to be the way others treat us and God's indifference to our pleas for help. Some core part of all of our hearts is convinced that life would flow along smoothly if God were only a little more like those Mesopotamian household gods. The truth is, we all come into this world with a predilection to live life under our own terms and according to our own understanding. We tell ourselves that we were not this way until the arrows came, and the arrows certainly do deepen and justify our proclivity to reject God. Yet Jesus tells us through Paul in the 3rd chapter of Romans that there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. Verses 10 through 12. There is a way that seems right to a man, says Proverbs 14:12, but in the end it leads to death. Genesis gives us an in-depth account of God using both crippling and blessing over the years of the patriarch Jacob's life to show him that his salvation and hope were in a more redemptive story than his own cleverness and manipulation could create, one that God was authoring. This is not the way we often see it, though. In our experience, it feels more as if God just allows bad things to happen to us out of indifference or malice. There's a fascinating illustration of a modern-day Jacob, a man trying to find redemption in a smaller story, along with God's fierce determination to disrupt and entice him back into the larger play, in the popular movie Forrest Gump. Forrest is a likable man of borderline intelligence who grew up struggling with leg braces due to polio and all of the cruel tauntings that those who are different often suffer. He's thrown into a seemingly random scenes in American history, much like the white feather that drifts with the wind throughout the movie. He finds himself in Vietnam under the leadership of Lieutenant Dan, a rough but capable man whose family has produced a long line of military heroes killed in combat. Lieutenant Dan is confident that dying with honor on the field of battle is his redemption. When he is rescued by Forrest from a firefight, his wounds require both legs to be amputated above the knee. He and Forrest, also wounded, are consigned to the same hospital ward where one night the rageful Lieutenant Dan drags Forrest from his bed. He proceeds to choke and curse him for destroying his life by saving him. "I was supposed to die on that battlefield, Gump," rages Lieutenant Dan. "I used to be Lieutenant Dan. Now look at me. I'm just a cripple." In response, Forrest observes with poignant simplicity, "You still Lieutenant Dan," leaving him to collapse in grief and despair. Lieutenant Dan, like all of us to one extent or another, is convinced that who he is inextricably tied to a self-redemptive story that alone will bring him recognition, honor, self-respect, indeed, salvation. When that is taken from him, he is engulfed by shame, anger, and despair. He goes to New York City and enters a purgatorial story of his own making, killing all desire for redemption. He lives off his veterans' benefits in a haze of alcohol, drugs, and sex with prostitutes. When Forrest comes to see him, Lieutenant Dan relates to him that some of the other veterans at the VA hospital have been telling him he should just trust in Jesus. "Can you believe it, Gump?" he remarks bitterly. "They tell me that Jesus will walk with me on the streets of heaven." But Lieutenant Dan can see no larger story than the one that has been stolen from him. He continues to pursue the destruction of his soul with the same zeal with which he once pursued glory on the battlefield. On New Year's Eve, God, the Wild One, disrupts him again. Lieutenant Dan has corralled Forrest into going back to his apartment with 2 prostitutes to ring in the new year with hedonistic disdain. The prostitutes play the game, each of them pretending great attraction to Lieutenant Dan and Forrest. When Forrest is uncomfortable with his date's advances, he clumsily resists. With the place she's acting out ruined, she spits out, "What's wrong with this retard?" and begins to berate Forrest. And here Lieutenant Dan finds out that he has not been able to totally kill his heart. He is filled with both rage at the treatment of Forrest. He is filled with rage at this treatment of Forrest and orders both of the women to leave, prompting a barrage of derogatory epithets from them as they exit. With his heart again exposed, he's brought to the realization that he still cares. And with this realization, he is plunged into something beyond despair. The scene ends with a close-up of the death mask of his face stretched over a heart filled with inconsolable emptiness. But God is not through with Lieutenant Dan. Forrest travels to the Gulf of Mexico to try his hand at captaining a shrimp boat, a plan inherited from his army buddy Benjamin Blue, who was killed in the same firefight that took Lieutenant Dan's legs. Forrest is bringing his boat back to the dock one afternoon after a fruitless day of casting for shrimp. On the dock, cigar clenched in his teeth, his wheelchair adorned with "America, my kind of place" sticker, is Lieutenant Dan, ready to try his hand as Forrest's first mate. The strangeness of hope has once again provoked him to another try at self-redemption from his self-imposed hell. But once again, the divine disruptor thwarts his efforts. Lieutenant Dan confidently directs Forrest to where he's sure the shrimp are hiding, only to have their nets repeatedly regurgitate onto the deck a collage of old tires, license plates, leather shoes, and a clam or two. By this time, Lieutenant Dan is convinced that God is working against him somehow. He passively assents to Forrest petitioning the Almighty for his favor as a member of the congregation of an otherwise all-black church. As Forrest sways disharmoniously with the choir members and handles the praying, Lieutenant Dan sits at the rear of the church, violently downing whiskey and waiting for Forrest to appease this uncooperative household god that has attached himself to his life. The ensuing day's shrimping brings no more harvest than before. With storm clouds gathering in the background, a completely frustrated and furious Lieutenant Dan rages. "Where is this God of yours, Gump? I wish your Jesus were here right now." And Forrest comments to his listeners with rare irony, "It's funny Lieutenant Dan said that, 'cause right then, God showed up." God sends a storm that puts the boat in mortal danger of being destroyed. Unbowed, Lieutenant Dan lashes himself to the mast, filled with joy at this opportunity to finally have it out with his tormentor. He curses God and dares him to sink the boat. But God has another purpose for Lieutenant Dan. He allows the storm to rage until his anger is spent, but does not kill him. Later, we learn that Forrest and Lieutenant Dan's boat has been the only survivor in the entire shrimping fleet. As they once again ply the shrimping grounds, now without competition, their hoists and nets strain to release one cascading swarm of shrimp after another onto the deck of the boat. As Forrest recounts the story of them becoming millionaires to a credulous but kind lady at a bus stop, he asks if she would like to know what happened to Lieutenant Dan. As he describes the scene to her, we see Lieutenant Dan sitting on the rail of the shrimping boat. The anger and fear so long entrenched there are gone. In their place are a kind of reflective surprise, like that of a man who's been redeemed in a most unexpected way. "Forrest," Lieutenant Dan says in a quiet, almost shy voice, "I've never thanked you for saving my life." And with that, he hoists his legless body over the side. As Forrest hurries to the rail with some concern over his intentions, we see Lieutenant Dan backstroking peacefully through the water with a gentle smile on his face. As the camera moves away, we leave him swimming up the reflected gold highway of sunset on the water, even as Forrest remarks, "I think Lieutenant Dan finally made his peace with God." And again we wonder, what is it that Lieutenant Dan has discovered? What healing has he received, even though his legs are unrestored? So often, like Lieutenant Dan, before his healing, we feel that God is not only unconcerned about our plight, but that he is actually working against us. And sometimes we're right. The story of Lieutenant Dan is a poignant and revealing portrayal of God's fierce intentions to use both crippling and blessing to redeem us from our self-redemptive and purgatorial stories. Indeed, in the 17th chapter of Acts, Paul gives the Athenians the stunning news that every single thing in the lives of both nations and individuals is orchestrated with the sole objective that they may seek God. Verses 26 through 28. This revelation requires some reflection. We're used to thinking of the great movements of history, even the movements in our immediate relationships as being impersonal, if not arbitrary. But with God, who notes the fall of every sparrow, the events of our lives are thoughtfully and thoroughly orchestrated to bring about our redemption. The days of our lives were ordered and numbered before there was one of them, says the psalmist 139:16. And yet the ways of his redemption often leave us trembling and fearful. Frederick Buechner, in his novel Son of Laughter, nonetheless invites us to relationship with this wild deity through the words of Jacob. Jacob's journey has come full circle. The smaller story he was attempting to live through deception and manipulation has been rewritten by the purposes of the wild romancer, who is God. He is once again in need of redemption. His sons, Simeon and Levi, having just murdered Hamor and Shechem, along with all their people for the rape of their sister Dinah, Jacob is ready to let Simeon and Levi die in turn to cleanse, redeem his family from the curse of the household gods. Rachel, his wife, stole from her father's house, having brought them with her on this journey home. Instead, the fear, the only name by which Jacob knows God, commands him to sacrifice a red heifer and use the ashes to purify his sons and himself. Noting that they are cleansed on the outside, Jacob laments that the household gods still control them internally with their promises of earthbound blessing. He exhorts his family to give the fear their hearts trust, even as he buries all the household gods under the oak tree where Abraham so long ago built his altar in memory of the three angels come to pledge him to God's covenant. Here are Jacob's words to us through Buechner. The unclean blood no longer clung to our hands, but the small gods clung still to our hearts. They clung with silver fingers, with fingerless hands of wood and baked clay. Like rats, the gods gibbered in our hearts about the rich gifts they have for giving to us. The gods give rain, the swelling udder they give, and the sweet fig, the plump ear of grain, the ooze of oil. They give sons. To Laban they gave cunning. They give their names as the fear, the Jabbok, refused me his when I asked it. God named is a God summoned. The fear comes when he comes. It is the fear who summons. The gods give in return for your gifts. The gods give in return for your gifts to them. The strangled dove, the burnt ox, the first fruit. There are those who give them their firstborn even. The child bound to the altar for knifing as Abraham bound Isaac, till the fear of his mercy bade the urine-soaked old man to unbind him. The fear gives to the empty-handed, the empty-hearted. As to me from the stone stair he gave promise and blessing, and gave them also to Isaac before me, to Abraham before Isaac. All of us wanderers only, herdsmen and planters moving with the seasons and gales of dry sand move with the wind. In return, it is only the heart's trust that the fear asks. Trust him though you cannot see him, and he has no silver hand to hold. Trust him though you have no hand to call him by, though out of the black night he leaps like a stranger to cripple and bless. Do you really care for me, God? Can we trust the stranger who leaps out upon us? Could it be that his glory and our well-being are really part of the same script? If only we understood his heart more clearly. Okay, that's the end of chapter 5. I do apologize for my terrible reading today.